let's take a peek at slide 6 and the debate over slavery that will take place at the convention. Uh, Northern states, as we know, at the convention wanted to abolish slavery. And when I when I say that, I am not saying, nor should you interpret, Northern states wanting to abolish slavery does not equate to all Northerners opposing slavery, or even all Northerners supporting equality between African Americans and white Americans. But it does show that there's a sentiment. There's a sentiment among many Northern states to kind of shed the new nation of this stain. The Northern delegates at the convention, many of them felt slavery was a stain on our nation. Any nation, many Northerners felt, that allows the buying and selling of human beings, they morally had an issue with it. They didn't feel it was morally right. And two, what does it suggest about a country that's emerging as an independent nation that talks about liberty and equality and freedom? What does it suggest about that country if that country is born allowing human beings to be bought and sold on it? Yeah, it's clearly hypocritical, despite the fact that they wrote these glorious. And I love the Declaration of Independence, which talks about their rights to life, liberty, and the right to pursue happiness and equality. But the document clearly shows a disconnect between what the new country wanted to espouse, what the new country wanted to promote, and what the new country was actually doing. So Northern delegates wanted to abolish the slave trade. Southern states wanted to continue it, and the compromise is the decision to not do anything, really, effectively saying that Congress could not ban the slave trade until 1808. In other words, the convention agreed that there will be no legislation. There will be no laws will be passed between 1787 and 1808 that will abolish slavery. I use the phrase, they kicked the can down the road. That's absolutely what they did. They left it to another generation. They left it to another group of political leaders. They left it to elected officials who would follow after them. Many at the convention were embarrassed by this. Many were, Northerners were, they looked at this as the ultimate in hypocrisy, the ultimate in hypocritical actions. But Southerners rejoiced, because it meant for at least 20 years slavery would continue as is in the Southern states. This compromise was made, and I think I just answered the question. The compromise was made because the delegates did not have an opportunity, and would have failed in the opportunity to have a new constitution written, because if Northerners held firm on wanting to abolish slavery at the convention, all of the Southern delegates would have walked out and left, and there would have been no solution. Now, as bad as waiting 20 years to address the issue of slavery sounds, it did provide for an opportunity for the Constitution to be written. And that's important. But clearly this compromise was made because they did not want to address the big elephant in the room. Everybody knew, well, I'll go out on a limb here, even supporters of slavery. If you were to catch a supporter of slavery in an honest moment, and you were to have an eyeball, face-to-face conversation with even the most sincere supporter of slavery in the South, if you ask most honest Southerners, is slavery morally wrong, many would most likely argue yes. but slavery was so entrenched and so much a part of life in the South among white Southerners that they were not willing. They were not willing to part with that way of life and the benefits that slavery afforded white Southerners. And not all white Southerners owned slaves. A majority of white Southerners owned no slaves. But slavery was an important way of life in all of the South nonetheless. Okay? I've got a video that we're going to watch, so you can finish your notes on whatever you're jotting down now, and I want you to watch. It's an 8-minute clip on how slavery was discussed at the convention. Okay, working through tech. It's looking pretty good today. Spoke too soon.
Slavery was one of those issues that always lurked in the background at the convention. It is obviously an institution that early on in the history of the country created a lot of animosities, a lot of deep feeling and concern. Even those who held slaves, and some of the convention did, including Madison, recognized the immorality of the institution. But you've got to also recognize that for the South, it was essential to the economy. It's hard for us to even begin to understand that. We tend to judge it by our own standards. But, you know, slavery was one of those issues that the South built its economy on. And so it was not easily dismissed, even though it was recognized to be immoral by many.
It's pretty important to keep in mind when thinking about slavery at the Constitutional Convention that none of the delegates went to Philadelphia to deal with slavery. They were there to build a government. And they kept coming upon slavery. It kept being relevant to the representation issue, to the regulation of trade, with the slave trade. So they kept bumping into it, and they would have much preferred never to have to talk about it. And when they ran into it, they suddenly found themselves on what James Madison identified quite accurately as the true fault line of American politics at the time, between North and South, between slave and free.
If you look at the Constitution itself, the word never appears. I think most of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention would have preferred if the issue were not there. They didn't come there to discuss slavery, they came there to create a nation. And yet they found themselves, as Americans still do today, forced to consider it, forced to discuss it, forced to deal with it. I like to describe slavery as our original American constitutional sin. It was a complete contradiction of everything we stood for. If you look at the soaring rhetoric that Jefferson wrote in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, you know, all men are created equal, that it's completely a contradiction. And the founders knew this, even slave owners, people like Madison, people like Jefferson, they knew it was a contradiction, and they struggled their entire lives to deal with it.
There are a lot of people who consider slavery to be the original sin of the Constitution. The problem that we have to recognize with slavery is that the institution itself likely was going nowhere. Just about every state had slaves when the Constitution was ratified. Some were moving in the direction of abolition, but all of them had slaves. So as a consequence, the idea that slavery was going to be abolished in the Constitution was problematic. I certainly wish it had been, but it wasn't going to happen. Once we recognized that slavery was going to be a part of the new nation, then the question was, how do we deal with it? Different delegates had various visions of slavery. Even some of the delegates who were slave owners didn't much like slavery. At least they professed not to like slavery very much, but they recognized that it was a part of the American landscape. And as a consequence, they dealt with it as opposed to trying to fight to abolish it at that time. There, of course, were some delegates who said that they really wished that slavery would be abolished and tried at least to have those discussions. Those discussions didn't go very far.
There were many people at the convention, I would say most, the vast majority, who were morally opposed to the institution of slavery. But it was very clear that there would be no union.
So when this professor says everybody at the convention, most everybody at the convention was morally opposed to slavery, what is she saying? Northerners and Southerners, Lizzie, are morally opposed to slavery. Yeah. They know it's not right. They know it's wrong. They know it's not wrong. Even the most brutal of slaveholders in the South that are at this convention, even the slaveholders who owned the most slaves, they recognize, hey, you know what? There's something pretty screwed up about human beings owning other human beings. But it was so much a part of Southern culture, they were not willing to acknowledge, at least publicly, the immorality of slavery. Because if you acknowledge that slavery is wrong, what's the next? What should follow? If you acknowledge as a Southerner slavery is wrong, the next thing that should follow is what, Bailey? Yeah. How many of you know somebody who smokes? We all know somebody who smokes. Do they know it's wrong? Do they know it's not healthy? Do they know that it's probably going to shorten their lifespan? Why do they do it? It's all they know, and they're addicted to it. Okay, this is kind of like the institution. I'm not suggesting that this is something that could not have been addressed. It should have been addressed at the convention, but it was not addressed for that reason. Slaveholders in the South were not willing to bargain on the institution of slavery. It was, you know, there's an old political cartoon on the issue of slavery at the convention. A group of delegates are sitting at the table, and the issue of slavery comes up from one of the northern delegates in attendance, and the guys at the table from the South are sitting there, and one Southerner has his ears covered, one Southerner has his mouth covered, and one Southerner has his eyes covered. In other words, the topic of slavery, they didn't want to hear about it, they didn't want to know about it, they didn't want to discuss it, because they all knew it was wrong. Okay? Jefferson, to point this out, to underscore this, Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, described slavery in the following terms. Jefferson, who owned slaves and owned them until he died, said the following about slavery. Slavery he described as like trying to hold a wolf by the ears. It's kind of a metaphor. He described slavery as like trying to hold a wolf by its ears. You're afraid to hold on to it, but you don't want to let it go. You're afraid to hold on to slavery because you know it's what? Wrong, but you don't want to let slavery go because it's all they know, and also there was concern that if you freed slaves, what might happen to white Southerners if slaves were freed in large numbers all at once? Imagine that wolf. What's going to happen if you're holding a wolf by the ears and all of a sudden you let it go? It could attack you. It could turn on you. That was a concern too.
If they tried to abolish the institution in 1787. And so what happened more than slavery disrupting the convention was that there was a tension between North and South.
Real quickly on this topic, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier this year, but Washington, Virginia slave owner, our first president, to kind of give you an idea of how even slave owners knew slavery was wrong. On Washington's deathbed in 1799, Washington, who knew he was dying, he had a throat cancer, throat infection, he had hours to live. He called his wife, Martha, into his bedroom, and within hours of dying, he instructed Martha to free all of his slaves upon his death. That acknowledgement, I think, on Washington's part suggests, doesn't prove it, but it suggests that in his heart of hearts, he probably what? He knew it was wrong. Palin.
How do you, like, people know the difference between free slaves and ones that escaped?
So how do people know the difference between slaves and just free African Americans? Free African Americans in northern states before the Civil War oftentimes could live their lives like regular Americans. They were often excluded. They oftentimes lived in their own communities. They oftentimes lived in and among white Americans. But most people recognize the difference between African Americans, slaves, and free blacks by the strict codes that were placed on slaves that prevented their movements. If you were a slave, like Baltimore was a city where there were a lot of slaves, but there were also a lot of free blacks. If you were a slave in Baltimore, you had to travel with papers that would pretty much identify you. You had to have papers that, and slaves oftentimes would be off the plantation doing things for their masters, running errands, picking up groceries, or doing various tasks. If you were if you were an African American slave, you had to have papers to justify that you were, you had permission to be. It was almost like a permission slip. You had to have a pass. Free blacks did not have to have those, and oftentimes, because of racism, free African Americans would be expected to produce those passes whether or not they were slaves or not. So you can often tell the difference between a free African American and a slave by clothing. Slaves typically wore clothes that were issued by their master, and the clothes were typically very simple, very plain. Okay, listen.
Free slave, like, couldn't prove that they were actually.
If a free slave,
Like, couldn't prove
I
they
mean
were
free
actually-
African American.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That's what I meant.
Okay, a free.
Sorry, a free African American.
Yeah.
If like they couldn't prove that they were like free, what would happen to them?
If they couldn't prove that they were free and they came up against someone who wanted to press the issue, a law enforcement officer, a slave catcher. There's a wonderful example of this in Cambridge. Before the Civil War, there was an African American, free African American named the story 12 Years a Slave was basically based on his life. His name escapes me right now, but free African American who lived in Cambridge. He was a musician. He was a farm worker. He lived in Cambridge and in Saratoga. And one day, while slave catchers came north to catch a runaway slave, they came upon this this gentleman who fit the description of the runaway slave, meaning he was black and he was a male. This man was taken into slavery. He was basically taken by slave catchers. They couldn't find the man they were looking for, so they took the first African American that they came upon, and he spent 12 years a slave in the South, and he was eventually freed. The wonderful movie was made about this gentleman. Help me out, girls and guys. What is his name? We learned about him in 7th grade. Brain cramp right now. That was something that many free blacks might not have experienced, but definitely feared. There was a fear, a real fear, that if you were an African American who was free and you were in the wrong place at the wrong time because of discrimination, because of prejudice, because of bigotry, that you certainly could be dragged into a life of slavery. That happened. That happened often. It didn't happen to all free African Americans, but certainly in the back of their minds, especially if free blacks lived in the South. If you were a free black person living in the South, you walked around on eggshells because the risk of being kidnapped, the risk of being taken into slavery, the risk of being made an example to slaves. For example, if African American slaves see free blacks in the South, let's say an African American group of slaves are running an errand, and they have a pass, and they're running an errand to a market to pick up goods, groceries. The worst fear for white slave owners was slaves seeing free blacks that were successful and prosperous. Why? If I'm a slaveholder, why do I not want my slaves seeing a successful African American family, Haley? Yeah, it gives them hope. It gives them reason to believe that one day they can be free. So that was a fear. That was a real fear for free blacks, that they would be somehow dragged in. And frankly, if you lived in the South, this is what's going to cause a lot of free African Americans to migrate north before the Civil War. It's just free blacks in the South it's better than being slaves, but free African Americans in the South still faced a lot of discrimination. They still faced, they couldn't vote, they could not run for office, they could not serve on juries, they had no real political power. So what's going to happen as northern states start to abolish slavery, the Southerners, black Southerners who simply don't want to face the risks as a free African American, they start the journey north, where they have better opportunities for jobs, they have better opportunities for, I don't want to say equal treatment, but I'm going to say fairer treatment than they would in the South. So I hope that answers your question. Palin.
I didn't understand what's called escape. If they like if they tried to escape,
Widen
like
larger
come
than-
off and stuff.
Yeah.
Free blacks and whites,
Some slaves would try to escape. There were devices that would allow people to recognize slaves. I have a ton of images that you'll see in this course, and as we move further along in the school year, one of the devices that slaves who were maybe off the plantation had to wear would be a slave collar. We talked about this before. A slave collar is basically a collar, a metal collar made of wrought iron, and on the collar, coming up at like 4 points, are prongs, and the prongs had bells on them. And the collar was padlocked in the back, where the slave could not get the padlock undone, of course. And as the slave was roaming through town on an errand for his master, he's literally walking around with a slave collar with bells, and that whites in the South were trained, if they saw an African American walking around with a collar on that had bells on it, light bulb goes off, oh, that must be a slave, yeah.
Free African American, like, were to be slavery, and like their family was able to produce papers, would they be let out of slavery?
Yes, yes. Repeat the question so everybody hears it. I want to know. If a slave becomes free, is that what you asked?
Yeah.
If a slave becomes free and they're given papers to produce their freedom, if they produce those papers to like whites in authority, will that prevent them from being enslaved again? Yes. Yes, it would. Is it going to mean that those free African Americans are going to get preferential or equal treatment to their white neighbors? Absolutely not. Okay? There's a difference, a huge difference, between a free black and an enslaved black person. Huge difference. There is not a huge difference between how both of those groups are going to be treated by whites. Whites in the South are going to largely treat free African Americans with the same contempt and the same prejudices that they're going to use and that they're going to exhibit toward slaves. And this is why many free blacks are going to migrate to the north, especially in the period before the war. And there'll be migration after the war as well, but we'll get to that. Let's finish this up.
South, all throughout the convention, in terms of questions of representation and taxation, particularly because of the slavery issue.
Part of the issue with slavery and some of the issues that the delegates had to deal with were purely economic. Those economic decisions drove their approaches, the delegates' approaches in some ways, to the issue of slavery. In those areas where folks believed that slavery was integral to the particular economy, they protected it, and they protected it fiercely. In those areas where they believed that slavery was less important to the economy,
If anybody's wondering, the African American man from Cambridge his name's Solomon Northup. He was a very successful worker, very successful, I think he was a musician, free African American who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time in Saratoga County, Washington County, and was basically abducted, taken into slavery. Later in the school year, if time permits, we'll watch the film in class. It's a wonderful film, tough to watch, but a great film nonetheless.
it was less likely to be protected.
A critical moment for slavery to really send the convention off the tracks came about 2/3 of the way through the convention, when the delegates had gone off on sort of summer break. They'd taken 10 days off. They'd left 5 delegates back as a special committee to prepare a draft. They had adopted a bunch of resolutions about what the government should look like, but they didn't have a draft constitution. These are men who knew what a draft constitution looked like. They didn't have one, they needed one. And the draft constitution that was presented when they got back in early August had been dominated in its preparation by a fellow named John Rutledge from South Carolina, who was a very effective delegate, I think underappreciated for his impact on the Constitution. And his mission was to defend slavery. And the draft that they presented had extraordinary protections for slavery. Congress could not adopt restrictions on commerce by less than a 2/3 vote. There was a guarantee of the slave trade forever and ever for the importation of slaves. And there was a provision that provision of the Constitution could never be changed. So this slowly began to rankle with the other delegates. After a couple of days, Gouverneur Morris, he was from New York, although he was a Pennsylvania delegate there, got up and made what is sometimes called the first true abolitionist speech in American history, and he denounced slavery, which took some guts to do. Slavery was legal in 12 states. Only Massachusetts had prohibited it. He called it a curse of heaven that will curse the nation. And he demanded a vote on the subject, and the vote was all the delegates against him except Jonathan Dayton, who was the youngest delegate from New Jersey. Even John Dickinson of Delaware, who had freed his own slaves, stood up and began expressing discomfort with this draft constitution and its pro-slavery provisions that the Rutledge Committee had produced. And finally, seeing that this was all going south on him, Rutledge said, okay, let's have a special committee and we'll rethink this stuff. And the slavery provisions were ameliorated.
One of the questions that concerns Americans today is why the founders allowed the institution of slavery to continue. If you work through the convention and actually see what the arguments are, you see that the Southern delegates, especially from South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, would not have joined the Union on any other terms because their constituents simply wouldn't allow it. And it wasn't the case that they made the argument that slavery was defensible. It was, many of them felt that slavery had been cast upon them, and it was an evil, although they called it a necessary evil. The question is, if the other delegates had abolished slavery, how many slaves would actually have been freed? You see, the answer is none, because the South, where the institution of slavery existed, would not have joined that union.
And that's important. The three largest southern states, North, South Carolina, and Georgia, would have left the convention. They would have left the convention. They would have not joined the new union. And because they would not have joined the union, the professor here is arguing that none of those slaves would have been free to begin with. So slavery, the legacy at the convention is important. What we're going to do next, and trust me when I tell you this, guys and girls, we will be spending literally the bulk of the school year back and forth on this issue of slavery. I mean, this doesn't end it. This video and this slide will not end our conversation of slavery. But for now, as the convention is addressing the issue, just understand that there was no real effort on the part of the convention to address it other than to say that it's not going to be abolished and that no effort to abolish could happen until at least 20 years down the road in 1808. Now in 1808, we will see a law passed by the Jefferson administration which will ban the importation of slaves from Africa. It will not, I repeat, it will not ban slavery. It will simply make it illegal to bring slaves in from foreign shores. It will make it illegal to bring slaves in from Africa or from other countries. The workaround, we talked about earlier in the week, the workaround is how does slavery increase if you can no longer bring slaves in, if you can no longer import them. The workaround is to breed slaves, and that is what's exactly going to happen. All right. All right, next page, please. Let's go to our next page. and we're talking about division of power. Let's talk about federalism. We're talking about issues that were resolved at the Constitution. Federalism is the division of power between and among the national government and the state governments, okay? Federalism, division of power between national and state governments. National governments, okay, are going to be given specific powers, and the states are going to hold on or retain to others. Your textbook, I think, does a pretty good job of pointing out, and for our purposes, I don't want to get too bogged down in this right now, but for our purposes, understand that federalism was necessary because under the new Constitution, it was recognized that the national government had to have some degree of authority over the states. The national government had to have some degree of national authority over the states to allow the government to function. Remember, we said earlier in the week, under the Articles, the national government couldn't force the state governments to do what? Pay taxes. Well, under the new Constitution, okay, that is not going to be an option. The national government is going to be in a supreme position over the state governments. Now, it does also mean, though, federalism means that there are going to be delegated powers for the national government and specific powers for state governments. No longer can state governments wage war. No longer can state governments like Massachusetts or New York, no longer can they be involved in warfare with a foreign country. No longer can state governments choose to determine what the tax rate is going to be on goods they import. Okay? So all those things are going to have to be decided ultimately by the national government. But what's going to happen is states are going to retain specific powers. States are going to retain specific powers. So, and that balance, that sharing of power between state and federal governments is going to be vital as the Constitution is being drafted and written. And that idea, I don't like to write on these if I can avoid it, but federalism is just as alive and a part of our Constitution today as it was when the Constitution was written. There are specific powers of state governments. Who issues a driver's license? Does the national government in Washington issue a driver's license, or do state governments? State government. Who gives me my teacher's license? A national government in Washington or a state government here in New York? State government. Who determines whether you are eligible for what body or what form of government determines whether you're eligible for public assistance, social services? National government or local governments? Local or state? No, most public assistance is provided at the local level. So if you're, for example, there are some federal programs, but Rensselaer County, for example, has a program, and this is even further down than the state government, but Rensselaer County has a program that helps pay people's heating bills during the wintertime if they struggle, if they're below a certain amount of income. That is an example of a local program, a local government program that is helping people. That is not a function of the national government. Who can declare war? What branch of, what part of our government, national government or state government, is going to be involved in defending the United States? The national government. The national government. Now, there are state militias and there's National Guards, but the United States Army is part of the federal government. Part of the federal government. So federalism is the sharing of powers. That's a key word, guys. We're going to have that down. Federalism is the sharing of power between the federal governments and the state governments. And we'll be talking a lot about that as the year rolls on. Next up. Why is my slider not working? It's just not, but that'll be all right. Move this up. Separation of powers, another, girls and guys, this is huge. The Constitution, the new draft in 1787, is going to include this idea of separation of powers. And you might remember from 7th grade, separation of powers was the brainchild of a French philosopher named Montesquieu. Montesquieu. Montesquieu came up with this idea of 3 branches of government. A legislative branch to make the laws, the executive branch to execute or carry out the laws, and the judicial branch to determine if laws are fair or not. So under separation of powers, the government is going to be divided in the Constitution into 3 branches. How many, by the way, take a look at the 3 branches that we have under the new Constitution. How many branches of government existed under the Articles? 1. What was it? Legislative branch. Legislative branch. We had a lawmaking body that made laws and made treaties and made agreements. Okay? Well, now we're going to have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. Each branch is going to have distinct powers, defined powers, and each branch is going to have limited powers. Okay? Legislative branch, let's make sure we have this. What branch of government would constitute our legislative branch under the new Constitution? What body or what group of people would constitute the legislative branch? There's 535 of them today. We talked about it yesterday. The House of Representatives and the Senators combined, they are called the what? The Congress. Okay? So legislative branch is the Congress. Executive branch is headed by what individual under our Constitution? Haley. Executive branch is headed by what person? You said George Washington? Well, the first, yes. Who today? Who heads the executive branch today? President Biden heads the executive branch today. And the judicial branch is going to be the system of courts on our national government. And the top court in the land would be what? What is the name of the highest ranking court in the land? Supreme Court. Supreme Court. In the news today, by the way. More news. More sad news, actually. Supreme Court. Right before class, I saw a news headline. Another man has been arrested for threatening to kill members of the Supreme Court, for threatening to assassinate members of the Supreme Court. I'm not sure which members have been targeted, but you might recall in 2018, 2019, during President Trump's first couple of years, Justice Brett Kavanaugh was the subject of an assassination attempt by a lunatic outside of his home. They found a man outside a sitting Supreme Court justice's home with guns, ammunition, grenades, knives, and unfortunately nothing happened, but we'll pick up on this topic tomorrow.